Thank you so much for joining us for this CUFI webinar about faith to action. I'm Karina, I'm CUFI's Communications Associate, and today's webinar is a part of our special initiative, the CUFI Virtual Experience, that we're launching in order to continue pursuing our mission, even as we practice social distancing, continue to educate and empower millions of Christians to stand with Israel, even during the difficult times that we are experiencing right now. And so thank you so much for participating. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for being here with us and staying connected with us as your CUFI family. We are going to talk about faith to action, putting our faith to action today. But first, I want to mention that today is actually the 2-year anniversary of U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And so the Golan Heights is a strategic plateau that overlooks Syria, that is on northern Israel. And it's very important that Israel is in control of this plateau in order to protect her citizens, which for years were experiencing rocket attacks and a barrage of terrorism from Syria in the north. And so this recognition actually came about after CUFI released a statement that backing associated legislation after CUFI, it launched a month-long advocacy campaign. And so I bring that up, not just to say happy anniversary, but to mention that being a part of CUFI, being a part of this webinar, doing what you're doing your part to stand with Israel, matters. It's part of a huge movement, millions of Christians standing with Israel and making a tangible difference on the ground, making Israel more secure, stronger, and her people safer. That's huge. And so thank you so much for being a part of CUFI. Thank you for joining us. And let's go ahead and jump into it. We're going to be talking about faith to action. It's a little bit of an oxymoron, and we're going to see why, but it's a good picture nonetheless. True faith always demands action on our part. True faith always requires action from us, and we're going to be talking about that using Abram as an example, and the book of James and what James writes to us in that letter. I want to mention that yes, we are going to talk about COVID-19. We are going to talk about it in the context of faith and action, and how we as Christians should respond to it, and how we should just react to the situation. And I don't want it to seem like talking about support for Israel is callous, like it doesn't matter, it's irrelevant with what's going on. It's not. Support for Israel is just as critical now as it was before this pandemic began. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to hit on it a little bit later. So let's go ahead for right now. We're going to jump right in. I'm going to share my screen with you all so you can see some slides, just a couple slides for today to keep us engaged. So faith to action, let's jump right in. We have to start. I want to start by keeping this central question in mind. I want all of us to keep this at the front of our minds as we're going through these slides. This question, what are you doing right now that requires faith? That's a question that someone posed to me a few years ago, and I haven't stopped asking that of myself every couple weeks, every so often. What am I doing right now that requires faith? Faith, as we're going to see, is not just a feeling. It's not just a belief. It's not just a thought process, but it changes the way that we live. It impacts the way that we live, the things that we do. So think about this question, mull it over in your mind, meditate on it. What are you doing right now that requires faith? And so let's start by defining faith. Faith is believing God's promises. Hebrews 11:1 says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So some theological terms in scripture, big terms like justification, sanctification, some of them we have to define based on their context, right? We have to define them based on their usage. But faith is actually a New Testament word that defines itself for us, and that's very helpful. So faith, it says, is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. So in other words, faith is being so sure of an unrealized reality that it's as though that reality has been realized. I like the way the NIV puts it. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So fundamentally, faith is belief in God's promises, and we see that here at the top. Faith is believing God's promises. And one of the prime examples, of course, for that is Abram. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here for a moment. So Abram, of course, hopefully we're all familiar with his story. It's a good one, and we love it here at CUFI. We call Abram the father of faith in Christendom, and for good reason. His story starts, of course, in Genesis 12. God calls Abram with a simple word, a simple command: go. And of course, it wasn't simple. Abram was an idol worshiper with his family. He was living where his family lived, in Ur, and the Lord simply appears to him and says, go. And yet the Lord does not just give him a command. The Lord gives him several promises. And of course, we're familiar with these. He promised Abram land, blessings, descendants, a great name. And he promised that the descendants of Abram would be a great nation after Abram. And we know from the Genesis narrative that Abram obeys. He obeys God's command. He leaves his country, leaves his extended family, takes his nephew, his wife, his many possessions and servants, and he travels to Canaan. When he arrives in Canaan, it is occupied by Canaanites. And so the land is nowhere close to appearing as though it will be Abram's anytime soon. And moreover, when Abram arrives, the Lord reappears to Abram and says, you see this land? Well, to your descendants, I'm going to give this land. And so bear in mind, at this point, Abram has no children. He doesn't have any children. He has servants. He has his wife, but they are barren. And so not only is he coming into a promised land that is occupied by another people, but he has no children to confirm that this promise can even come about. And furthermore, when he arrives, we read that there was a famine in the land. And I just think and I think about that a lot. I think that's so interesting, the nature of walking with God, that God can call you and you can obey to the T, and you can arrive in the promised land and there's a famine. There is lack. There is scarcity. And it can seem for that moment as though you are in the wrong place. You did the wrong thing. You must have heard God wrong. And yet Abram did not hear God wrong. He obeyed exactly what God intended for him to do. And the famine that he walked into was intended by God as well. And so he's meant to stay the course, to keep the course, and allow God to work out his promises. And so in Genesis 15, after Abram has sojourned in Egypt, he has had an incident with Pharaoh and his wife and the harem. He has rescued his nephew from some evil kings and won a war. All this has happened already. And the Lord reappears to Abram in Genesis 15. And he says, do not fear, Abram. So first thing he says is, do not fear. You just went through a war. You've been in famine. A king approached you and could have put you to death, but do not fear. And he uses Abram's name. It's a personal touch. He says, do not fear, Abram. And why? God says, I am a shield to you. God's offering his full protection over Abram, his protection to ensure that his promise will come about. And that's why he says next, I am a shield to you, and your reward shall be very great. And so God reappears, reconfirms his promise to Abram. And here I'm going to start sharing my screen again for us to look at this next verse, Genesis 15:6. Abram responds right before this verse, and he says, well, how am I going to inherit the land? How am I going to have descendants if I have no children? The heir of my household is my servant. And God tells him for the first time, no, your heir will not be your servant, will be someone who will come forth from your own body, someone who will be your literal physical descendant. And he takes Abram outside and he shows him the stars. And don't you just love when God gives us a truth, but he accompanies it with a picture? I think it's just better when he does that. It's easier for us to get. He shows Abram the stars of the sky, and he says, if you can count these, then you'll be able to count your descendants. And so then we read in Genesis 15:6 here on the right, Abram believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And so at this point, Abram has obeyed God. He left his country. He left his family for the land of Canaan, the land of promise. He stayed in the land to the best of his ability. He returned to the land. But it's not until Genesis 15 that we read that he believed God. And that faith, that belief in God's promises that we have here, that was credited to him as righteousness. That was enough for him to be declared right with God. And that is beautiful. So we have here Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. And so we have to cut this apart a little bit and think about it. Without faith, it's impossible to please God. Okay? What kind of faith pleases God? We must believe that he is. And that reminds me of Exodus and God's revelation of himself to Moses. He says, I am that I am. We must believe that God is who he says he is. Of course, we must believe he exists, but we must believe that God's character is as God says that it is. And that is not enough. That is not enough. We must believe that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. And so Abraham's obedience alone, by going into the land of Canaan, by leaving his country and his family, that was not faith. Obedience by itself is not faith. Faith always results in obedience. And we're going to talk about that on the next slide. But obedience by itself is not faith. Okay? You can obey without believing who God is or believing God's promises for you. And so at the same time, faith is not simply believing that God exists. And that's what we read here in Hebrews. Yes, we must believe that he is. But the opposite of atheism does not equal faith. We must also believe his promises, that he's a rewarder of those who seek him. That is true faith. And so let's go ahead and look at this next slide here, a faith that works. And so the book of James is one of my favorites. It's written to Jewish believers in the diaspora. James says he's writing to the 12 tribes dispersed abroad. And so he's writing to Jewish believers who are scattered around, who are going through various trials, we read in chapter 1, and who are experiencing a little bit of a tug of war, a push and pull between religion and a relationship with the Lord, and the difference between those two things. And so in chapter 2, James begins to expound on the nature of faith and how it relates to works. And so he says, and if you have a Bible, if you have your phone, read along with me, feel free. And James 2, verse 14, he asks, what use is it, my brethren, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? In other words, if someone just has faith, but has nothing to prove it, is that true faith? And I want to go ahead and share again to show you this picture here on the left. This is an example. So James says, if a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. And so this is what we do a lot, right? A Christian brother or sister is in need, and we are aware of it. We're either made directly aware or we see it happening and we say, wow, I hope it gets better. I'll be praying for you, right? Even though we have it in our power to help them, we don't do it. That is, James says, a consistent pattern of doing that is not true faith. Faith always is accompanied by works. And so he says, someone might say, I have faith and you have works. Okay. Show me your faith without works, you'd be like this empty shelf here. Faith without works, there's nothing to show for it. How can we know that it's there? But he says, I'll show you my faith by my works. And the example he uses is Abraham. He uses the example of Abraham in Genesis 22. Abraham offers up his son Isaac on the altar at the command of God, and God steps in and offers a ram as a substitute. And in Abraham's life, we knew already from Genesis 15 that he believed God. He believed God's promises. He had faith. And yet it was not until Genesis 22 that the ultimate test of faith was imposed upon him. And he offers up the child of promise on the altar. This is the conduit of all God's promises. Through Isaac, his descendants would come, right? The promises would all be fulfilled through this child. And God says, offer him up to me. And Abraham does it. We read in Hebrews that Abraham had such sure faith in God that he thought, oh, God is able to raise people from the dead. And so Abraham knew this is the child of promise. God's promises to me are sure. If God says to offer up Isaac, he will find a way to bring Isaac back and to fulfill his promise. That's how deep, how profound Abraham's faith was in that moment. And so the angel of the Lord approaches Abraham there and says, now I know that you fear God. We know that Abraham had faith and feared God in Genesis 15. The proof was demonstrated in a powerful way in Genesis 22. And so faith is always accompanied by actions. And that's why I said in the beginning that faith to action is almost an oxymoron. Faith always is followed by action. It demands obedience on our part. Obedience by itself is not faith, but faith leads to action and obedience. And so we have Abraham as a prime example of that. Now, moving forward, what does it have to do with Israel? I mean, we're a CUFI. What we're about is standing with Israel, supporting the Jewish people. What does that have to do with CUFI and support for the Jewish people? I want to bring us to Psalm 122, and I'm sorry I forgot to put the reference there. It's Psalm 122. We're not going to read the whole thing, but we're going to highlight those bolded pieces. Often in CUFI, we love to quote Psalm 122, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And why? Because we believe it is still relevant for believers today. We believe that this is a command that is still incumbent upon us as Christians to obey. And we bring this verse up a lot. It's important. However, sometimes even we can forget the end of the verse, right? It says, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. And we embrace that promise. It's basically Genesis 12:3 repackaged. I will bless those who bless you. So may those who love Israel prosper, right? May peace be within your walls and prosperity within your palaces. May Jerusalem be a city of peace inside and out. That's our prayer. For the sake of my brothers and my friends, I will now say, may peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good. Now, that's the part I want to dwell on for a moment. Prayer is effective. Prayer is effective and powerful. James tells us that later in his letter in chapter 5. He uses Elijah withholding the rain and then sending the rain as an example in that passage. And so prayer is one of the most powerful things that we are privileged to do. Hudson Taylor, a missionary to China, said, God has condescended, he has stooped to place his almighty power at the command of believing prayer. He's condescended, he stooped down to place his almighty power at the command of believing prayer. This doesn't mean that we tell God what to do. This means that God, in his eternal wisdom, has chosen for certain events, certain outcomes, only to come about based on the prayers of his people. Prayer is powerful. So we covet prayer for Jerusalem. We covet prayer for Israel and the Jewish people. And bear in mind, Jerusalem here is serving a poetic function. It's a part for a whole. Jerusalem is representative of Israel and the Jewish people in general. And so David is not just saying pray for the city of Jerusalem. He is saying pray for the peace of Israel and the Jewish people, God's covenant people. And so we covet prayers for Israel. Obedience demands that we pray for Israel. We pray earnestly and often for Israel. However, the example that David sets in this passage is not only one of prayer. The example he sets is one of action. He says, I will seek your good, the good of the city of Jerusalem. He will actively put forward his energy, his resources, his manpower, his wisdom, his ability, his planning to bless Israel, to seek the good of Israel and the Jewish people. And so faith to action when it comes to support for Israel is not just prayer. It's not just believing God's promises for the Jewish people, even though that is important. It also has to be accompanied with action. And so when we see an opportunity to bless Israel in a tangible way, like the opportunities that we have through CUFI, through this movement, those are opportunities that we're called to take. And why? Because of the example that David sets here in this passage. I will seek your good. We want to bless Israel in an active way, not just with our thoughts and our prayers and our emotions, but with our actions. And so what are some ways you can do that quickly here? You can get involved with CUFI. Like I said, we are over 8 million members strong. The resources, the manpower, the abilities, our capacity for change, our capacity for impact just keeps growing. This movement is divinely orchestrated. That is why, because God is behind this movement to stand in solidarity with his people. When we gather together for Summit, when we gather together for a local CUFI event, Christians standing with the Jewish people, we are reversing centuries of Christian anti-Semitism against the Jewish people. We are healing old wounds which say that the Jews should not trust Christians, that the Jewish people should not make friends with Christians, that we are dangerous, that we are sneaky, that we don't want what's best for them. We're reversing all of that when we stand in solidarity with the Jewish people. And so one of the best ways that you can get involved is to attend the DC Summit. Lord willing, on June 28th and 30th, we will gather in Washington, D.C. We'll meet with our members of Congress. We'll hear from top Israeli and U.S. officials. And we're going to be together with like-minded individuals. And when I tell you the experience of being there in that place at that time with such a movement of people, that is life-changing, that is transformative. And so we would encourage you, if at all possible, to attend the DC Summit. It's a huge way you can start to get involved. Respond to action alerts. These are emails that you'll get from us when we have a piece of legislation or a policy item that's important in your state or your district. We're gonna let you know what you can do to help us advance that legislation, to help us get this thing changed, to get it done. And that is in part why the Taylor Force Act was passed. It cut funding to the Palestinian Authority. They were paying terrorists, and they still are. And they killed a young American soldier on tour in Israel. And so those action alerts are invaluable. Those are making a difference. And so you can respond to those. You can ask us how to become a congressional liaison. Congressional liaisons build relationships with their elected officials throughout the year, with their representatives. They are the top tier of activists that we have in CUFI. You can ask us how you can become one of those. We need them in your district, in your state. You can share the trailer for the Never Again documentary. This video, this film, full-length feature film, following the stories of our friend, Holocaust survivor Irving Roth, and our Middle East analyst, Kasim Hafiz. This film is going to impact so many people. It's going to be in theaters in October, and students who have never heard about the Holocaust, who don't know what Auschwitz was, they're going to see this film, and they're going to be forever changed. And we need all the support that we can. We need prayers. We need financial support. We need you sharing this with people, getting the word out, so that this film can have the maximum impact on the most amount of people. And then lastly here, you can sign up to receive CUFI's daily briefing. This is going to be an email every morning in your inbox. It's going to have the top headlines, the Israel-related news, so that you can keep up, so you never miss a headline. It's all compiled there for you with links so you can read the full article. That's important to help you stay in the know when it comes to Israel and the Middle East. And CUFI's coffee break. This is also in your email. It's a weekly lesson. It's gonna take 2 to 3 minutes. You can read it while you're making another cup of coffee. It's gonna be on topics that are fun, like Jerusalem Day, informative, like Passover, but also topics that are historical, like the Balfour Declaration, and current, like the Golan Heights. So these are an awesome tool for you to stay knowledgeable and to grow in your knowledge and your activism. So briefly, let's touch on COVID-19 now. We know that as a world, around the world, as a society, as a nation, we are in a state more or less of panic, of fear, of uncertainty. And so this has gripped our nation in a way that nothing has gripped it in a long time as a whole. We are a part of something bigger than us right now. We are painfully aware of how much we need each other in this time. And so, of course, we need to remember, first and foremost, that God is in control. And that might seem cliche, something we've heard before, but God is truly in control. His eye is looking around the world to strongly support those whose hearts are completely his. God is protecting and surrounding his people as the mountains surround Jerusalem. He is preparing a place and a future and a hope for every one of his children. He knows those who are his. And so when we say God is in control, it is not just a cliche. It is not just something to say because we have nothing else to say. We truly believe that he is in control of the situation and working it out for the good of his people. And so something to remember. Take this opportunity for Sabbath as well. As a society, we are busy, we are running, we are always going on to the next thing, and take this opportunity to rest, to really hear God's voice. Take this opportunity to recharge. Go back to the things that you love, the things that you're passionate about. Israel is one of those things that that passion, that calling is incumbent upon all of us as Christians to support Israel and the Jewish people. Allow this time to refuel, to feed yourself, to get knowledge, to use the CUFI virtual experience, to understand how you can better support Israel as a Christian and how blessing can come over your life through doing that. And so take that opportunity, enjoy your family, lead them restfully, peacefully also into knowledge about Israel. And of course, it's an occasion to help others. Thankfully, blessedly, for the most part, I have been inconvenienced by COVID-19. It's an inconvenience. TJ Maxx is closed. It's a problem. But I am not struggling to make ends meet. That's a huge blessing. Other people in my family, friends in my circle are not as lucky, are not as blessed to be in that situation right now. And so we need to be keeping our eye out, to be looking for those we can help, for ways that we can put our faith to action and we can help those in need. Like James said in James 2, this is a prime example of that. So I want to leave you with this quote here. Our co-executive director, Shari, she shared this with us about a week ago. And it's just there's such a poignant way of putting what our focus needs to be right now. It says, here's what we do know. As Jews, we don't ask why, we ask what. When tragedy hits, we don't question God's ways. We know he truly loves us and has a bigger plan. Instead, we ask ourselves, what can we do about it? And so that's what I want to leave you with today is ask yourself, what can you do about it? We've been talking about faith. What is true faith? And it's always accompanied by obedience and actions and works. So amid this crisis and these difficult times, yes, ask yourself, what can you do about the needs right at your doorstep, right next door? What can you do about those needs to meet them in a godly way? But also, how can you refuel and rekindle your fire and your support for Israel in these days? We have the benefit of being a little bit more free than usual. Our schedules hopefully maybe are freer. Use the CUFI virtual experience. It's a pop-up right when you enter our website. Use that resource to learn more about Israel, to stay engaged, to stay connected with us as a CUFI family. We have millions of members. We are resources for each other. We're all in this together. And so I hope this presentation has blessed you. I hope that you are recommitted to believe God's promises in your heart, yes, in your mind, yes, but with your actions. Let your prayers for Israel be transformed. Let them be taken to the next level where you actively seek Israel's good, that you get involved with CUFI. You tell your friends about Never Again. You make plans to attend DC Summit. Do what you have to do to make sure that what you're doing right now requires faith. And we're back to that central question. What are you doing right now that requires faith? And if nothing, pray like the disciples, increase our faith. Increase our faith. And so I leave you with that. Stay safe, stay whole, stay healthy, and stay blessed. Thank you so much.